come in, and of course the Crown dependencies, because what we've identified is that what we do in Westminster can have quite a significant impact on our overseas territories, but I'm not sure that we have always been cognizant in Parliament of what that impact is and when we're making our decisions. So we are looking now, we've broadened the scope of the inquiry from just the UK territorial constitution to that wider UK family, I think it's referred to, of overseas territories and Crown dependencies. And we're very grateful to the two of you coming to give evidence to that, which is the first evidence we're receiving actually in the first oral evidence. We've had written evidence, the first oral evidence we've had on this bit of the inquiry. I thought it probably be helpful for the committee if perhaps both witnesses could introduce themselves, and then we'll go into the questions. So perhaps Professor Clegg first.
I'm Peter Clegg. I'm a Professor of Politics and the Dean of Social Sciences at the University of the West of England. And I've been sort of studying and researching the overseas territories for around 20 years.
Thank you. John.
I'm John Davis. I'm Chief Executive of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, CPA UK, based here in Parliament, funded by the two houses through a grant and responsible to an executive committee. Both houses, we're about trying to strengthen parliamentary democracy across the Commonwealth, very much including the overseas territories, also the Crown dependencies. And we tend to do that by what we would call peer-to-peer learning, so bringing members and people from this Parliament together with their opposite numbers from across the Commonwealth.
And I should declare my interest that I have participated in a number of CPA UK programmes, and I do know the power and the value of those, the relationships that are built through the CPA UK, so I will declare my interest on that. So we're going to start questioning, and I'm going to start with Liz Twist.
Thank you very much, Chair. So if I can start by asking both of you, please, what's your understanding of the way overseas territories view having legislation made here at Westminster extended to them?
I think they're very cautious about it. They are concerned if decisions are made or the way in which legislation is framed, which might have a significant impact on them. They believe that, yes, of course, the UK Parliament is the sovereign parliament in relation to the overseas territories, but if at all possible, there should be consent and discussion about how any legislation, either through the UK Parliament itself or through orders in council, are implemented. So I think that's very important. And also a recognition that they are quite different. So, of course, there are 14 overseas territories, some 4, I think, uninhabited, 10 inhabited, different economic profiles, different populations, different geographies. So I think there is a great sort of resentment, I think you could call it that, when legislation is imposed in a rather non-discriminatory way. So I'd say those are sort of some of the key features that the overseas territory would see in terms of legislation coming from Westminster.
Yeah, thank you. John?
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think as well as the variety between the territories, there's also variety of opinion within them, as you would expect in any jurisdiction, any territory. So you're going to get different views on each subject and on the general principle, I think. I completely agree with Peter about consultation. I think as with any of us, if something's being done to you, you feel a inevitable impulse to want to have some input to that understanding of that. I think also we tend to work as CPA directly with, not with the governments of the territories, but with the legislatures. And the members of those legislatures feel a responsibility to the people who elected them in a way that will be familiar to members of the committee. So I think they genuinely feel that sometimes they aren't able to discharge that responsibility because they don't have a way of inputting into that legislation.
So if I can ask both of you, if you know of any examples of systems like the one we have here, where the centre can and does legislation for overseas territories?
There are quite a few examples which you may be familiar with. So France, the Netherlands, the United States, Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, Australia. So there's quite and those systems are quite different. Some are quite heavy institutionally in terms of their oversight of the territories. So the Dutch model, for example, the French model, they're quite intrusive. Others are less so. So there's a sort of a sliding scale, probably, in terms of the level of metropolitan involvement. So probably the French model is the most interventionist because those territories are actually part of metropolitan France, all the way through probably to the New Zealand model where the territories are, or some of them at least, are freely associated. So they have complete local autonomy, and New Zealand just oversees foreign affairs and defence. But saying that, there are some similarities in terms of the balance of responsibilities and power across all of those different models, I think. So ultimate sovereignty does lie with the metropolitan parliament. The territories are very proprietorial about their own sovereignty, and they resent that intrusion, that sort of constitutional overreach, which has been used within the context of the UK overseas territories recently. And there are problems about the economic position of certain of these territories, around law and order, around social policy, such as same-sex marriage or abortion or euthanasia. So it's interesting that although there's quite a difference in approach across many of these different territories, the fundamental issues and tensions are quite the same, I would say.
John, did you want to?
Very little to add, other than perhaps to point out what is obvious, especially physically obvious, if you go to some of these territories, particularly in the Caribbean, they are very close to each other and they see all this. You're talking about, sometimes sharing an island with people with it done very differently. Sometimes it's somewhere which is literally 15 minutes away on a boat. So those comparisons are not so an abstract for them. That is lived experience in their neighbourhood, if you will.
Well, I suppose there are two strands to this, really. The one is you started by talking about the perception from the overseas territories of UK legislation. One would be how much control is perceived as the UK as central legislature having, and the other would be how strongly people feel about it. It's like two lines. Could you give any kind of indication about where we might be along those lines?
In terms of the
or
UK,
would that vary?
In terms of the UK overseas territories, I think the balance is probably just about right under the present constitutional arrangement. So I think the FCDO in particular are very cognizant of the issue of consent, of not extending UK legislation, UK authority too deeply into the overseas territories, because they recognise, as John said, that each of these territories have their own parliaments or councils, and that's very important. The constitutional settlement is that there are certain reserved responsibilities for the governor, and then everything else is devolved down to the overseas territories as well. So I think that's really important to recognise. And when the UK does intervene, perhaps most recently and quite controversially when the UK Parliament in 2018 passed the anti-money laundering legislation, that was very controversial, provoked a very strong response from the local governments. And since then, there's been discussion about, independence. I think that independence is used quite loosely by many overseas territory leaders because it can sort of, strengthen their domestic base. So I don't think much thought has necessarily been put into the idea of independence, or indeed greater autonomy. But it's necessarily used and does worsen the relationship between the territories and the UK for a time. And there have been other examples of that in the past. Although that case in 2018 was quite exceptional because it came through legislation from the UK Parliament directly rather through order in council. So I think it's important to keep that in mind because that legislation was very particular and is not representative of how legislation more generally is implemented in the territories. But still, the territories are very protective of their autonomy and do respond quite strongly if such legislation, particularly when it's indiscriminate, is implemented.
Do you want to add anything?
I'm not sure I have anything to add on that, to be honest.
Thanks. So, Peter, if I can just ask you a couple of questions. How could the view of individual territories be better incorporated where primary legislation extends to them? And how could those views be made transparent to MPs here?
I would say, and I've covered a little bit of this ground already, there are three main areas where the overseas territories sort of have an interest in terms of the legislation coming from the UK. First, through UK Parliament itself. Secondly, through orders of the Council being approved by the Privy Council. And three, probably the powers of the Governor. So in terms of disallowing legislation, reserving legislation, or actually passing legislation themselves. So I think it's important to focus on those three general areas where the overseas territories and perhaps parliamentary committees could have more of a role in the say. So I think in terms of the orders in council, I think that, of course, largely is a negotiation between the UK government and the individual territory governments. And I think that's where consent, early engagement in the process is very important. And I think largely they do that. I think there's a risk sometimes when it goes outside of the purview of the FCDO to incorporate other ministries. Then the focus on the overseas territories is less important. And I know that the Prime Minister has recently instituted a mechanism to try and better have liaison across the departments, which is, I think, a positive thing. So in terms of orders in council, I think it is that government-territory interaction. Interestingly, where the governors have those powers, there have been a couple of recent examples where the governors have sort of blocked legislation, referred it back to the FCDO and for the ministers for discussion. Maybe that's an area where the committee system in Parliament could have a role to play, because that's quite opaque, that system of decision-making, but on areas which are quite important nevertheless. And there would be time as well, I think, for Parliament and the committees to provide a judgment, at least to sort of add to the discussion which is ongoing, maybe within UK political circles. And then in terms of direct UK parliamentary legislation, it's making sure that, again, the overseas territories are incorporated at a particular stage. Maybe you could bring them in, I'm not sure whether this goes against parliamentary rules, but in the committee stage, for example. So in the Dutch Caribbean, in terms of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, again, a different kind of a setup. But you do have Dutch Caribbean representatives coming into the Parliament when particular legislation is being discussed and it's applied to them. Again, they can't block it, but they are centrally involved in the discussions. So maybe something like that could be done in terms of the UK Parliament.
Thank you. And finally, would a model similar to Crown dependencies, where the UK Parliament can essentially only legislate with permission, work for overseas territories, do you think?
Really interesting question. So if you look at the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies from afar, you might say actually there are quite a few similarities. So the UK is sovereign. In theory, even in the Crown dependencies, the UK Parliament can legislate, although by history it doesn't really do that. There are tensions in terms of, are the UK government becoming too engaged in local affairs, and that's certainly been the case in the OTs, but also fairly recently in the Crown dependencies as well. And also there are ways, in terms of international treaties, for example, the approach is quite similar, where there is consent. There is discussion about whether treaties should be implemented in the OTs or the CDs, and it's not a blanket implementation. So at that level, you could say there are some similarities in terms of the way things are, at least in theory, could be done, and some of the tensions between them. But I would say the reality is quite different. There are constitutions for all of the overseas territories, but not for the Crown dependencies. There are acts of Parliament that underpin the relationship with the overseas territories, but not with the Crown dependencies. There's that long history of the UK not directly legislating for the Crown dependencies, whereas the overseas territories is quite different. But also there's quite an interesting different view, I think, amongst UK parliamentarians as well. So if you look at some of the reports from the Justice Committee over the last 10 or 15 years, it's very, very, very strong about the UK should not get involved and sort of not quite warning off, but sort of making representations that the UK government should be very careful before they get too involved in the Crown dependencies. Now, it's quite the opposite, I would argue, for the overseas territories, where actually in many of the recent parliamentary committee inquiries in the overseas territories, it's about actually inserting the UK more proactively into the lives of the overseas territories, whether that's in relation to same-sex marriage, for example, previously in terms of the death penalty, and other issues, particularly around social policy, but also human rights more generally. So that's an interesting view. I'm not sure whether because the overseas territories, of course, came from the sort of colonial route that the Crown dependencies didn't, whether there's a slightly more paternalistic attitude on the part of UK Parliament more generally towards the overseas territories in relation to the Crown dependencies. So I think that sort of mindset might have to change before the sort of comparisons are made between the OTs and the CDs in terms of what could be done. And finally, and maybe I'm not sure whether this is slightly disingenuous, if the UK government could start all over again, they might not want the level of autonomy that the CDs presently have. And if you look at the overseas territories more generally, Bermuda has the greatest level of local autonomy. And some of the OTs from time to time say, can't we move towards Bermuda's example? And the British government historically has said no. So I think that's an interesting issue in terms of where they are right now and whether further autonomy or further change could actually be given. And the British government feel that actually, because they have ultimate responsibility for the territories, particularly the overseas territories, they need the levers of power and control just to make sure that things are going well. And I think if things were equal, they would probably wish that to be the case for the CDs as well.
Thank you.
And it's really interesting you mentioned committees, because this is one of the areas we've been thinking about. And Tonya I'll get there eventually. Tonya has a question specific on committees.
Yeah,
I'll bring you in.
it leads really on quite nicely. I mean, you've spoken about the select committees work. How could select committees work more collaboratively with the overseas territories? And because you have said about a change in mindset, what are the lessons to be learned from previous inquiries by Commons committees, that we should keep in our mind throughout this inquiry?
Interesting. It's possibly doing some things which local parliaments in the territories can't. So if you look over the last 20 years maybe, in those parliamentary inquiries which have really been influential and are remembered, you could probably argue that the reports in the late 1990s around Montserrat, the volcanic disaster in Montserrat, which highlighted a number of quite deep-seated problems with the nature of the UK-OT relationship at that time. And of course, you had the new Labour government in 1999, and framed and influenced by those reports, you had quite significant changes, one including overseas, they were called dependent territories, they were called subsequently overseas territories. So I think the Montserrat inquiry, where it was very focused, it was looking at the profound relationship between the UK and the overseas territories. That was very successful. I think in 2007-8, when you had growing concerns about the quality of governance in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and local people felt that their voices weren't necessarily being heard, and the UK government was not acting strongly enough to address the issues of alleged corruption there, then actually the Foreign Affairs Committee report was a lightning rod where people's voices could be heard, and that of course led to the Commission inquiry and then direct rule being implemented. And maybe a third example is around the hurricanes in 2017. So I say those were the most successful because they were very focused on particular issues of concern. They looked at the nature of the UK-OT relationship more generally, and they didn't get involved in perhaps issues that the territories would think are their own concerns. So perhaps one example of that is the 2019 Foreign Affairs Committee report, which had some interesting things within it, but didn't gain much traction because there was a focus, for example, on belongership, the local citizenship in the territories, and on same-sex marriage. And the response against the Foreign Affairs Committee going into those areas was very strong. And as a consequence, the nature, that the whole sort of report was put to one side because of that. So I would say that, the greatest impact is on those real sort of high-profile issues which look at the nature of UK-OT relations more generally, not when you start to look into particular OT local issues, even though they might be important.
Do you want me to carry on, or do you want me to...
No, well, Jack wants to come in, and Aaron as well, so I'll bring in Jack, and John also may want to say something.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go to the points that you were raising about issues that are sort of deemed out of scope, and the mechanism for that is that the Governor would intervene and basically rule that then it has to be referred to ministers for a decision. Do you think that process is currently working, or does it need to be changed and reformed?
Again, it's one of those which the position of the Governor is a very tricky one. I don't think there's any other position like that in terms of, the civil service at all.
Do you think it's a bit compromising as well for that position, potentially?
I think it is compromising, but it's difficult to know what the alternative might be. So, of course, they're representing the UK government. They have their own responsibilities, but also they're sort of representing and promoting the territories themselves. They do have some powers, the reserve powers, but actually they're quite blunt instruments, and when they are used, it does cause significant disquiet within the territories. The BVI example is a recent one. So actually there is about persuasion and consent and discussion. So some say that the governors are wearing two hats, and sometimes it's very difficult to wear those two hats. Sometimes when they get too involved in an issue, their sort of softer role is compromised within the territories as well, and therefore overall their role is affected. So it's really difficult, and of course you're parachuted in as a governor into probably quite a specific political culture where everybody probably knows each other. There are sort of unwritten rules and ways of doing things. So again, that is also a challenge, and the governor's staff is relatively small. So I think for all those reasons, it is a challenging role. Most of the time it's done well, but there are clear inherent tensions in that. But again, what could be put in its place, I'm not sure if there's anything different, again, under the present constitutional arrangements, which could do a better job.
And how frequently is it the case that these sort of issues are coming up where the Governor is having to intervene?
I think there are different levels of intervention. So sometimes it's a word to say, actually, do you really want to do this? Are you sure about doing this? Then it's perhaps going back to the FCDO and saying, actually, I need some help. We need some technical experts. We need some additional assistance in these areas. Or, of course, it's the nuclear option and saying, we need a commission of inquiry or something like that. So I think there are different levels. And the nuclear option, the commission of inquiry, is always the last resort, always done very reluctantly. Sometimes you could argue governors wait too long to make that decision. So you could argue, certainly in the Turks and Caicos Islands, that the extent of corruption or alleged corruption was so significant and so long-standing that actually stronger action earlier might have been beneficial. But it's again acting in a territory with its own local democratic political systems, and the fact that most of the territories are economically self-sufficient as well. So on both those fronts there is a reluctance to intervene, and sometimes perhaps they just wait too long before they do so.
Are there any things that you would recommend in terms of how we could improve that process and change that process?
One issue is in terms of the accountability of the governors. Of course, they're accountable to the minister in the FCDO, but they're not, I think they're probably accountable to judicial review, maybe, in the territories. But I think, and in previous evidence that in past inquiries, the FCDO has said, well, it's the role of parliamentary committees to bring governors in to talk about their role. So maybe that is something which doesn't happen too often, but actually would be a good mechanism, because it's something that the local governments can't do. Otherwise, it's just linked into the UK executive. So I think that could be quite a nice midpoint where the UK Parliament does provide that oversight and does sort of challenge and ask the governors, what they're doing, their role, and things like that.
Ron, is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of possible changes that could be made to improve the transparency, accountability of that process?
The thing I would say is less about the process, but it may be a way to improve it. Is that if I think back to my previous role, which was 25 plus years in the Foreign Office, I would wholeheartedly agree that the governor role is a very unusual one, and it's not actually really a diplomatic role normally. So I think making sure that the organisation of the FCDO puts enough training, support, etc., into making sure that the people fulfilling these really responsible roles have the training and support they need to do that properly, and that it's taken as seriously and given the weight and support that it needs to have, because obviously the better that's being done, the more within the current constitutional setup it's likely to work. I think then, if I may, it does then need some continuity and understanding, ideally in the ministerial portfolio. Mm-hmm. It is one of several ministerial portfolios that's changed hands quite a lot within the Foreign Office structure, and I think
particularly, as well as was referenced earlier, if it ends up being a department beyond FCDO, yep, it may not be exposed and have that experience of dealing with overseas territories and crown dependencies.
And that's right. Is most civil servants, most government officials, ministers will not have that experience. So I think that would help, so that the individuals fulfilling these challenging roles actually are able to do them to the best of their ability. The process, I wouldn't add really anything to Peter said. If I may just quickly on committees, I think I agree with what's been said, but I think there's also, as it were, that softer role of committees supporting each other. One thing we tried to do at CPA UK is actually bring people from committees here, both members and officials, to help local committees at least do what they can within their local jurisdictions to get the most out of their own parliamentary systems, because they have got similar sorts of responsibilities that you have here in your select committees, whether it be public accounts or the like. So I think that support for their processes and understanding how the process here fits with the process in territory would also help. I think one subject where, forgive me, I'm not sure whether there's been a UK Parliament Select Committee inquiry has been into how trade has affected the overseas territories. I think there have been some looking at this by the International Trade Committee, as was. But that is the subject which we at CPA UK have heard most from the territories about the disquiet that they feel, the disconnect between their interests, and actually this goes to the Crown dependencies as well to a large extent, that they feel that in the very complex period of the last 7 years for the UK, as we look at our future trading relationships, that still a way has not been found to really understand and include and represent the interests and the views of the people of the overseas territories, who are all in their often very different ways massively affected by the change which is still happening. And that does feed across into legislation, particularly at least in terms of treaty-like trade agreements that are made in this place, but often will apply to them willy-nilly. So I think looking at how this place thinks about, includes, talks to the various layers of government, whether it be the government in the territories, the legislatures in the territories, the governors of the territories, would be another good place to go to show we're listening.
I have heard, members of the Trade Committee obviously raise this issue and talk about the lack of involvement of some of the overseas territories in trade agreements. Is there a mechanism that you could think would be appropriate to involve some of those in those discussions about future trade agreements?
I think it's part of a broader picture. I think we're still working out how to do that across the piece. I think not forgetting the overseas territories is as part of that, as this place keeps evolving with a relatively new select committee, the new trade committee, thinking about that committee working out how it can involve that. To be honest, I can't think of specific ways of doing that. I think it actively seeking out evidence. Sometimes for overseas territories legislatures, this is a very intimidating place, and actually finding ways that they can be supported to bring evidence and bring questions. So maybe informal consultations and contacts with the people who understand the local context would be one way of doing it, short of those more formal sessions with whether it be governors or speakers or members of their legislatures.
Thank you.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for coming. Apologies for lateness. I was just with the Prime Minister's statement, and apologies if I have to leave early for the next statement in a while as well. I'd just like to go back a little bit to where we were sort of philosophically about all of this, because, you know, I visited Gibraltar recently with the Armed Forces scheme and so on. There's obviously very deep historic ties to Britain, but my question is whether the relationship that we have with the overseas territories, and indeed the Crown dependencies, if you want to comment on that, has become more transactional, whether it has become, and from the point of view of the populations, not just the First Ministers and the people who, the point you made earlier, Professor Clegg, was well made, that sometimes First Ministers say things and that's for domestic consumption. But do the populations feel that relationship they have with Britain is now transactional, that we pay for their defence, we might bail them out if there's a natural disaster like Montserrat or hurricane season or whatever, and in return that they accept that we have some right to legislate for them? Or is it still actually founded on a sense of Britishness that, you know, perhaps warrants more involvement, more formal representation?
I would say it's probably both. That's not copying out of the answer. So I think the ties are still strong. I think when one looks at the coronation of the King or the death of Queen Elizabeth II, you know, there was genuine emotion and engagement and following what was happening, and the involvement of OT representatives and CD representatives in those official ceremonies in Westminster were, I think, very important. So I think there is a strong bond, and I think it's about, in a more slightly abstract way, the nature of the legal system, of the sort of the standards emanating from the UK Parliament of democracy and transparency and accountability and all of those things. So I think there are some key sort of fundamental underpinning issues which remain very important, and they then go into sort of the more transactional aspects. So I think one reason why there is no support for independence across any of the territories amongst the more general population is a recognition, actually, when it comes to final legal processes, when it comes to making sure democracy is maintained, actually having the UK there to ensure those things are maintained, I think is very important. And of course, when there are natural disasters, when there are economic problems, knowing that hopefully the UK will engage, will provide assistance, is very important as well. So I think they stand in their own right, but also there's an important connection between those two aspects, which make overall the relationship still pretty strong.
Transactionally, do they think they're getting a good deal, if you view it in a transactional way?
It's an interesting question, because, and it's about the sort of who has responsibility for what. So an area where the UK is often criticised is not intervening or not helping more significantly in environmental issues, for example. Now the UK would say, well, we can provide technical support, we can provide advice, but actually that's a devolved responsibility, the environment. But then the territory might say, well, can you give us some more support in this area? So there's a tension there sometimes between what's a devolved responsibility and what's not. How far the UK should get involved, financially or otherwise, or not. So again, it's an interesting area. And there were always great demands. And if you take John's point about looking at the neighbouring French territories, for example, which have significant French and EU funds, their infrastructure is much better. Their roads are much better. So again, there's a contrast there, and you know, territory citizens do ask, why is the UK not providing greater support? And that is a tremendous difference between the French territories, where there is so much funding coming in, although there are issues about how productive their economy is, how much unemployment there is, so there are downsides, compared to the UK position, which is probably more similar to the Dutch position, where we actually try to encourage these economies to be self-sufficient. Of course, that's another area where the UK says, actually, in terms of the economy you can do certain things or not, and that's again perhaps encroaching into local concerns.
Sorry, Mr. David.
Thank you. I think it's real variety. I mean, you mentioned Gibraltar, which is unique within the ones we talk about, even within the Caribbean territories. The feel will be very different. I've visited only 3 or 4 of them, so I can't judge as a whole. But I think there is still a strong link. I think when the transactional side works well, it's really appreciated. I think I'm right in saying in certainly all the territories I've spoken to people from, the support during COVID-19 was really exceptional. The fact that the vaccines got to quite difficult places very early, earned some justified plaudits, and that will be remembered for a bit, I suppose. I think in education, quite often in many of these places, it will still be where younger people come to study if they study beyond 16, but not all of them. And that's where I think competition from the States, from Canada, from other places will, over time, change the mindset. You've got populations even in somewhere which you might think of as having the very strong links to the UK, such as the Falklands. The Falklands actually has a very diverse ethnic population now in terms of the nationalities that live in the Falklands. So they're all even though they're small populations, quite complex in the variety of loyalties you will have in that territory. I think there is still, amongst their legislatures, which is what I know best, there is still a strong focus on this place. I think you will know the interest of the Commons Speaker, Mr. Speaker in the territories, the network that's been created in his term between the speakers of the Commons and the Overseas Territory speakers, I think is a very productive one. And that has reinforced that British link. So I think in terms of their legislatures and their parliamentary structures, they very much will look, despite the evolutions of their own systems, will look to this place as a model and as somewhere to come for when they have questions and hope to get answers.
Thank you. And yeah, the vaccine point is well made. It was hugely appreciated in Gibraltar.
Yeah. And actually, the point about the networks is really has come up actually when we talked devolved parliaments in relation to committees as well, that maybe there could be networks for procedure committees and administration committees and public account committees and various other committee structures could form networks that would be valuable and we could get learning from each other. So that's a really interesting point. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both. This has been really helpful. We spoke a little bit at the start about issues around consent and transparency, and as the Chair said, this aspect of the inquiry sort of builds on other work we've done around legislative consent from the devolved institutions, and the Sewell Convention governs that, although there have been a number of dramatic or at least specific examples where the Sewell Convention has been observed in its breach more than its practice. I wonder if you have any reflections on not necessarily the issue of consent or vetoes in itself, but in terms of how if we were to bring about changes, if this committee were to recommend changes around procedure for informing the House of the consent or otherwise of the devolved assemblies, what impact that might have on how such opinions are communicated when they're made in the overseas territories or crown dependencies, and how we could draw all of that together.
Thank you, I think. I'm not an expert on this, but I think that at the risk of stating the obvious, if you're consulting and if it's going to increase consent, the consent of whom within the territory, and need to be thinking really carefully which part of that very complicated structure that Peter's talked about you're talking about. Is it consent from whom? From the people who have been elected to represent the people, from the governor? Whose consent are you talking about? And I think being really showing that any committee here or any people here have thought about that and understood it, and it comes also through to who represents them in the UK. The territories all choose to be represented in London in slightly different ways with slightly different powers, and again understanding who can speak for what part of a territory's sort of constitutional setup. I think that may seem really obvious, but I think it's quite complicated, and you're often talking about very small numbers of people, and I think being really, really careful about any mechanism you do create that actually it understands that often very narrow but multi-layered setup within a territory. But
I would just add, in many ways, because the present situation is quite informal in some ways, so it's not enshrined in any particular document, it can be quite effective. So you do have different pressure points and different points of engagement, which in some of the territories elsewhere that have more formal structures you don't have. So the risk is that if you put something too formal in place, everything goes through that route. And the existing, quite informal but quite sort of elastic structures are lost. So I think because of that complexity, whether it's the governor, whether it's the citizens, whether it's the territory governments, whether it's the OT reps in London, actually that's quite difficult to really properly quantify. So I would argue that actually the existing relationship with some tweaks on the margins would still be the best way to go. And the issue of consent, of course, in the Crown dependency example, there is consent by sort of precedent and by history. But in terms of the overseas territories, there's only consent up to a point. So actually the UK government does have it in its right, and we've seen that, where actually consent is not given, but changes are nevertheless made. So just that's an important point of clarification, perhaps.
Well, that's very helpful. But just on that point, I think particularly where consent is not given, because that's kind of what we've been looking at in terms of the relationship with the devolved institutions as well. How best is that? And I think John sort of touched on that. How best is that communicated to this House, that the government is acting often on its executive authority or whatever, but how are parliamentarians made aware of that? How best can we be made aware of that in order to scrutinise that decision of the government?
Yes. So I know at the moment when constitutions are agreed and passed through orders in council, that they are placed to the Foreign Affairs Committee, I understand. Now, whether something similar could be done for legislation, again, through order in council. So again, it wouldn't be necessarily unpicking what has been discussed or agreed or decided, but it's certainly a way of seeing what's going on and providing some kind of reference point and transparency to what has been discussed, sometimes in quite private circumstances.
You want to come in again, John?
Just going to say, I think it echoes some of the discussions that have been had more broadly on trade and trade agreements. And I think, again, they're working out how much information early enough to actually make a difference. I mean, I think a sort of false consultation or a false seeking of consent is often worse than none at all. So I think thinking through what information can be shared when, both with members of committees of this House and then with the territory, is critical. Otherwise you end up with the worst of both worlds, the apparent consultation seeking consent, but actually no such thing, and that's not a good place to end up.
Can I just add, occasionally orders in council are threatened but not enacted, and that sort of precipitates local discussion. Maybe it's a bit of a crude way of doing it, but some of the over the last decade, some of the issues around financial accountability and probity in the territories has been done through that way. So again, that it's not always you move to order in council. That can be used as sort of a mechanism to try and provide that consent and agreement earlier on.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
You were quite generous to parliamentarians earlier, Professor Clegg, when you assumed we had a lot of knowledge about which territories were overseas territories and which ones were Crown dependencies, and put a lot of thought into how differently we treat them. But how much awareness do you think there really is in Parliament of which of these regimes are actually overseas territories, which are independent, which are Crown dependencies? I sense actually most of us would struggle if you gave us a list of territories to know which camp to put them all in.
That's probably a fair comment. I think there's a small number of very committed members of Parliament and Lords who, are aware, do have that knowledge, do engage significantly, but many do not. Many perhaps come into this space only occasionally, and therefore lack that background knowledge. I think assumptions are often made. And even those who are very committed to the cause I think there's a degree of, I mentioned earlier about paternalism. So I think that's very important as well. So I think we sort of know best in relation to certain issues because we sort of know the territories, they're our former colonies. And that's something which the overseas territories do significantly push back on. So I think there could be some kind of, I'm not sure how you do it, but an exercise just to talk more to parliamentarians about the overseas territories, about the Crown dependencies, about their differences, about their relationships, what the UK government and Parliament could do and can't do. But again, that would be quite a concerted and long-term project. But I think the greater the knowledge, the greater understanding, the easier in some cases it would be for the territories to influence and to make their arguments and representations as well.
To be fair, it takes somebody to know what's devolved to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, let alone any further. But I mean, being serious, it's quite a problem. If you think the solution's based around engagement, it's quite hard to get, isn't it? I think it's fair to say our evidence is mixed, is probably slightly generous on whether any of these territories should have representation in the UK Parliament. I think Gibraltar thinks it would quite like something, and I think the others are not quite so keen. I mean, is that your understanding of the situation, that actually most don't want to have an MP or a Lord here?
It was interesting. I read all the written evidence for this part of the inquiry, and clearly the Gibraltar government quite explicitly said that. And I think in terms of symbolic reasons, I think in terms of maybe feeling a bit more vulnerable after Brexit in their relationship with Spain, they might see having some kind of parliamentary representation as a positive thing. And there are certainly examples of that across the world. But it was interesting, they also said that we'd like to retain our exact same status, or maybe go further in terms of our level of autonomy. And I can't think, to be honest, any example across the world where a territory has such parliamentary representation, where they've either maintained their existing relationship or become more autonomous. That actually the metropolitan influence grows, it becomes more significant. If you look, I mean, it's not an exact comparison, but if you look at the three Dutch Caribbean municipalities now, so Saba, St. Eustatius and Bonaire, who were part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and after the restructure about a decade ago, were incorporated more into the Dutch framework, had representation in the Metropolitan Parliament, and then it was much more hands-on in terms of the level of oversight and control from the UK. So I think you could talk about parliamentary representation, but I think you would have to accept that a degree of autonomy, a degree of freedom would be given up as a consequence. And that's why, for example, the Falkland Islands is quite in the opposite direction and feels that actually the access points that we've already talked about are the most effective ways of having influence and getting their views across, because they can access all parliamentarians rather than being sort of funneled through potentially one representative, either in the House of Lords or the Commons, and what voice, what influence they would have. And I think there are other risks as well. So there are political risks. So if there's a very narrow government majority in Parliament, would that representative be pressured to support the government or the opposition? And that has happened in some cases. I think in Ireland, for example, there were some discussions around that. So I think those are real significant issues, and that's why there's no consensus. And also, and again, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I think if, for example, Gibraltar was given an MP with the level of autonomy they presently have, there may be questions asked elsewhere in the United Kingdom about the impact of that as well.
Would we, John, go.
Mate, I feel you're right about awareness, and I think it's again reflective of the general population actually in this country not understanding the complexity of our relationship with those territories. I think you're right. There is a very helpful map for those of you in Parliament in the UK CPA UK room, for those of you who want to check. I think in terms of paternalism, I'd agree very much with what Peter said. I see that and hear that, a concern from elected representatives from quite a lot of the territories about the risk of being represented in a certain way by a member or members here, in a way they say, actually, no, it's for us to express our views, rather than expressing them through someone who, albeit well-meaning, is seeking to speak on our behalf, but does not necessarily understand our present-day reality and the wishes of our citizens. So I think there is a risk of that. I agree with you on the risks of representation. I think there is a responsibility on the territories and indeed the Crown dependencies themselves to think about how they represent themselves to this Parliament informally. We've talked briefly about the representatives here in London. You've got the Overseas Territories Association as an umbrella body. But I think in the end, like a lot of other organisations, they have to think how they present themselves, and they do think about that, and they have to be imaginative and work hard at making sure that people here do understand.
In terms of the
can I just bring Aaron in very quickly?
Sorry to interrupt, Nigel. I just wanted to ask whether there was any appetite you detected to copy the US model, where a number of their territories have non-voting representatives in the House of Representatives, such as Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and so on. Because that might answer some of the very real questions that you did raise about if they had voting members here. I think that undermines an awful lot of what.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, and they can represent themselves on committees in the US system. They can bring bills to the floor as well. But my sense is that if you want a representative, you really want a full representative, rather than one which is somewhat constrained. So again, I think in the written evidence there were suggestions, well, we only look at issues that are germane to us. So I think it's probably an unsatisfactory halfway house, which wouldn't fundamentally change the dynamic of the relationship between the UK on the one hand and particular OT on the other. And that's, of course, do you give them all representation? Do you give them a couple of seats and they share it between themselves? Again, there are practical issues as well there.
No representation without taxation.
Well, and that's a big issue for many of the territories as well.
Just very briefly, just having heard from the representative, I think, of Bonaire, one of the Netherlands territories you spoke about at the Commons and Overseas Territory Speakers Conference earlier this year, exactly that frustration with the relatively new setup under the Netherlands system, that actually it was more frustrating in that, yes, in theory you have this representation, but you can't actually do anything useful with it. So you are potentially have the worst of both worlds, that you have a voice, but actually you can't do anything useful or productive with it. And yet the metropolitan power can say, well, you're represented, you're here. So there is a risk, I think, to those territories who go down that path.
Nigel, back to you.
It would be remarkably generous, having just equalised the size of our own constituencies, to give some of these territories an MP individually, wouldn't it? I mean, there'd be a few thousand electors at best. I mean, I suspect one between them or two between them might be the only possible way of doing it.
Some of the populations are, I think, Cayman is about 68,000, Bermuda 64,000, TCI about 45,000. So possibly.
Yeah, but some of those are somewhat lower than that, aren't they?
Yes, and those three have no, I think, desire to have representation either.
We just touch back on the Privy Council and the Orders in Council thing. I remember very enthusiastically voting in 2018 for public registers of beneficial ownership, I think, was the order in council we required the government to do if the territories hadn't adopted it by 2023 or something. I don't remember what the timing was. But I mean, is there a way of improving the order in council process? We humble non-right honourable members have no idea what happens at to Privy Council, so I don't think I've got any idea what happens there, let alone somebody in an overseas territory, I suppose. But is there a way of making it feel more transparent and so they've got some kind of say in it?
Again, I'm no sort of expert of the Privy Council, but my sense is it is a very closed entity. It's not quite clear. You have a list of members, I think, but it's not quite clear who they're necessarily representing, if there are anyone in particular. I know that Guernsey and Jersey do have a subcommittee within the Privy Council, but I don't believe any Crown dependency representatives are part of that committee. So maybe going back to the earlier questions around sort of legislation, rather than looking at changing aspects of the Privy Council, which I would imagine would be quite difficult to achieve, it's looking at those earlier areas of access where the UK government is suggesting a piece of legislation is needed. It will go through the route of an ordering council, and at that very early stage you engage with the overseas territories, possibly bringing in UK parliamentary committees as well to look at that issue. So way before it gets to that position, that point, I think that's where any improved access and negotiation and deliberation could come.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, it should be a key part of, as it were, the stakeholder mapping. If you've got a piece of legislation or a piece of policy even that you're thinking of driving through, then working out early on how you tackle, as the UK government, whichever part of government it is, making sure the territories are part of that, which is hard work and it takes time and it's fiddly.
And again, there are some examples of that. So I think in relation to the Crown dependencies, when there's a discussion about implementing UK legislation in the Crown dependencies, ultimately it would go through an ordering council. But actually there's quite a lot of devolved discussion within the local parliaments about that. The UK government provides advice and their sort of suggestions about the implications of the legislation. So again, possibly that could be, in some cases, a way that the overseas territories could do things. But again, there are examples tucked away that could be used or adapted, that are used presently for the Crown dependencies, but potentially could be applied to the overseas territories.
Thank you. Back to Tonya and Tony Atsey. I've been practicing.
Thanks, Chair. Just a few questions for John, and I am aware that you have covered some of these things, but going back to strengthening relations and the select committee system, can you outline some of the work the CPA UK does with overseas territories, and where are the areas you think that the UK parliamentary links with OTs could be strengthened, either via yourselves at CPA UK or outside of that?
Thank you. Yeah, with pleasure. As I said at the start, we as CPA UK have always included the overseas territories in the work that we do, which is all about trying to strengthen their parliamentary institutions. For the last 7 years now, we've actually had a project which has had FCDO FCO and now FCDO funding, and that has focused particularly on public financial management, and that has been, part of it has been about the legislatures. So with us, this Parliament, the Public Accounts Committee in particular, working with other Public Accounts Committees across the territories, and we've run a consortium with the National Audit Office, so the UK National Audit Office and the UK Government Internal Audit Agency, to support those three strands of public financial management, oversight and scrutiny in the territories. And that has gone well. That has helped make increases in capacity in the territories, they say, and there is objective evidence of that, in their capacity to do those key tasks of a legislature. And we do that in the same way we do the rest of our work. It's mostly about peer-to-peer, it's about practicing, it's about learning, it's about, as it were, people like you, if I may, talking to their opposite numbers, talking about how you do this, how you ask questions, how you get answers, how you work with the auditors. And some of it is the other two strands are very, detailed. How do you do external audit? How do you do internal audit? What sort of handbook do you use? So it's very practical, the support we've been given. And I think there is learning for this Parliament from it as well. I think the members of this place who've been involved, and the officials of this place who've been involved in that work, have learnt about the territories and their challenges by doing that too, as well as the territories themselves learning from and understanding the processes. Obviously the context, they tend to do it in tiny legislatures quite often, as opposed to here, but the processes are often the same. So a lot of it is about that. We've slightly broadened that out in the last 2 or 3 years, the second phase of the project, to be looking at broader elements of how you make a legislature work well, how you make elections work well. We run the election observations for the territories and indeed the Crown dependencies. And again, trying to look at all parts of that democratic system and democratic cycle. And again, strengthening in very practical ways. How do you set up your election commission, your electoral commission? How you do the voting, how you do the publicity, how you count the votes, how you ensure diversity and equality in that process. Very practical advice. So from that part of the cycle through into post-election seminars, through into some quite detailed committee work. And we couldn't do that as CPA UK without the involvement of your colleagues on the various committees here and the staff of this Parliament. So that's been the core of what we do. Well, the Foreign Office keep funding us, so they say they believe it is worthwhile. Governors' offices support what we do. The legislatures support what we do because we do it with the consent, talking to the legislators and finding out what they want and how we can help. So I think more of that, I would say it, wouldn't I? But I think more of that is a good thing. That's virtually all funded by the FCDO at the moment, not part of our core funding. I'd love to have some of our core funding available to do that, and we're asking for that. And if we can get that, that'll help us make sure we can keep doing this, as it were, stepping up to Westminster's responsibility to support the other legislatures and the OTs.
So more cooperation and collaboration then?
Yes, and there's openness to it on both ways. It's not difficult to find the open door on that. Virtually all the territories, with the exception of Gibraltar, have a public accounts committee. So there's an opposite number committee to work with. They all have a version of an internal and external audit function. So there are people there who want and need the support. So the door's open really for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yes, I know we did a session actually quite recently as the Procedure Committee with a sister committee, and they were very interested in humble addresses and how they might start to use humble addresses. So that was a fascinating thing. I don't think we've got any more questions from the committee, so can I thank both of you for your very comprehensive answers and for giving us an insight into the differences, but also the common threads that run through the relationship that the UK has with the overseas territories. And certainly we will be using much of what you've said in our report and our recommendations. So thank you very much for your time. Order. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.